Sometimes the greatest gifts come from the smallest hands, carrying burdens far heavier than their shoulders should bear. High in the Colorado Rockies, where the October wind cuts through pine trees like whispered secrets, Margaret Holloway stared at her dwindling woodpile and felt winter's icy fingers already reaching for her bones. At 67, the retired trauma nurse had chosen this remote cabin precisely because it was far from everything. Far from the hospital where she'd failed to save too many. Far from the empty house where her grandson's laughter still echoed in every room. And far from a world that had taken too much from her already. But isolation, she was learning, could kill you just as surely as a broken heart. The storm had been raging for 3 days, dumping snow faster than she could clear it, and her meager firewood supply wouldn't last another week. With no cell service and the nearest neighbor 15 miles down a treacherous mountain road, Margaret faced a simple truth. She would freeze to death before Thanksgiving. That's when she first saw him, a small figure emerging from the white curtain of snow, carrying timber that should have been impossible for a child to lift. The boy's silence was as striking as his strength, and when he left the wood at her door and melted back into the storm without a word, Margaret wondered if the thin mountain air was finally making her see things that weren't there. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret stood frozen behind her frost-etched window, her arthritic fingers pressed against the cold glass as she stared at the neat stack of split logs now piled beside her door. The boy had vanished as quickly as he'd appeared, leaving only boot prints in the snow, small, deliberate marks that the wind was already beginning to erase. She blinked hard, then rubbed her eyes with the heels of her hands. The wood remained. "Get a grip, Margaret." The voice in her head sounded like Dr. Patterson, her old supervisor at Denver General. "You're a nurse, not some superstitious old woman seeing ghosts in every shadow." But nurses were also trained observers, and Margaret had observed something impossible. A child who couldn't have been more than 10 years old carrying timber that would challenge a grown man. She'd seen him heft those logs as if they weighed nothing, his small frame moving through the deep snow with an unnatural steadiness that made her skin prickle. The rational part of her mind, the part that had spent 40 years diagnosing symptoms and solving medical puzzles, offered explanations. Hallucinations brought on by isolation and grief, cabin fever, the early stages of dementia that she'd witnessed in too many patients over the years. At her age, living alone at 8,000 feet elevation, it would hardly be surprising if her mind began playing tricks on her. Yet when she cracked open the front door, letting in a blast of Arctic air that made her gasp, the wood was undeniably real. She bent down and touched one of the logs, running her weathered fingers along its smooth surface. The cut was clean, professional, the work of someone who knew their way around an axe and had been doing it for years, not the crude splitting she'd expect from a child. Margaret straightened slowly, her joints protesting the movement, and scanned the tree line where the boy had disappeared. Nothing moved except the endless cascade of snow and the dark branches of the pines swaying in the wind. The forest seemed to hold its breath, as if it were keeping secrets. She gathered an armload of the mysterious timber and retreated inside, bolting the door behind her. The cabin felt smaller now, its log walls pressing closer as the storm continued its assault. She'd bought this place 8 months ago, drawn by its remoteness and the promise of absolute solitude. The real estate agent had warned her about the winters, about the isolation, about the challenges of living so far from civilization. Margaret had assured her that isolation was exactly what she wanted. Now, feeding the logs into her wood stove and watching the flames leap to life, she wondered if wanting to be alone and actually being alone were two very different things. The warmth spread through the single-room cabin, chasing away the chill that had been her constant companion for days. Margaret settled into her grandfather's old rocking chair, one of the few pieces of furniture she'd brought from her previous life, and studied the dancing flames. The wood burned clean and hot, better than the green pine she'd been struggling to keep lit. Outside, the wind howled like something alive and angry, rattling the windows and sending snow spiraling in ghostly patterns. Margaret had weathered storms before, both literal and metaphorical, but something about this one felt different, more personal, as if the mountain itself were testing her, pushing her to see how far she could bend before breaking. She'd been bending for 5 years now, ever since the accident, since the phone call that shattered her world and sent her spiraling through a grief so deep she sometimes forgot how to breathe. Danny had been everything to her after his parents died. The light in her empty house, the reason she came home from her shifts at the hospital. Losing him had been like losing a piece of her soul. The therapists had used words like survivor's guilt and complicated grief, as if giving her pain a clinical name would somehow make it manageable. But Margaret knew better. Some wounds never healed, some losses carved holes in you that could never be filled. That's why she'd come here. To this forgotten corner of the world where cell phones couldn't reach and neighbors were just a concept. She'd come to be alone with her ghosts, to live out whatever time she had left without having to pretend she was healing or moving on, or any of the other things people expected from the grieving. But now, watching the mysterious boy's firewood burn in her stove, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in months: curiosity. Who was he? Where had he come from? And why had he helped her when she hadn't asked for help, hadn't even known she needed it? The flames crackled and popped, filling the cabin with blessed warmth, and for the first time since arriving at the cabin, Margaret Holloway didn't feel entirely alone. Whether that was a comfort or a curse remained to be seen. That first night, Margaret slept better than she had in weeks. The steady warmth from the mysterious boy's firewood wrapped around her like an embrace, and for once her dreams weren't filled with the screech of brakes and the sound of shattering glass. She woke to silence, the kind of profound quiet that only came after a storm had exhausted itself against the mountain. Pale morning light filtered through the frost-covered windows, revealing a world transformed. Snow had drifted against the cabin's north wall, reaching nearly to the bottom of the window frames. The trees stood like sentinels in their white robes, and the air was so still she could hear the distant crack of branches settling under their frozen burden. Margaret's morning routine had become sacred over the past 8 months, a series of small rituals that gave structure to days that might otherwise blur into meaninglessness. She started the coffee first, using the camp stove since she was saving the mysterious firewood for actual warmth. The familiar aroma filled the cabin as she performed her stretches, the same ones the physical therapist had taught her after Danny's funeral, when grief had literally brought her to her knees. Next came her medications, blood pressure pills that kept her ancient heart beating steadily, arthritis medication that made the mountain mornings bearable, and the small white tablets she told herself weren't for depression, just for taking the edge off. She lined them up on the rough wooden table like tiny soldiers, preparing for battle against time and sorrow. The routine continued with checking her supplies. Margaret had been meticulous about preparation before coming to the cabin. 40 years of nursing had taught her that survival often came down to planning and inventory management. She kept careful lists of everything: canned goods, dried beans, rice, flour, matches, batteries for her emergency radio. Before yesterday, the firewood situation had been becoming critical. Now, thanks to her mysterious benefactor, she could make it through several more weeks. But what then? The question had been lurking at the edges of her consciousness for days. She'd planned to stay through the winter, to prove to herself that she could survive alone, that she didn't need the well-meaning interference of her few remaining friends, or the patronizing concern of distant relatives who'd suddenly remembered she existed after Danny's death. Yet, watching the snow pile higher against her windows, Margaret wondered if pride was worth freezing to death over. She'd had a life once, before this self-imposed exile. Not a full life. That had ended 5 years ago in a Denver intersection, but a functional one. She'd kept working at the hospital longer than she should have, throwing herself into 12-hour shifts because going home to an empty house felt like drowning in slow motion. There had been colleagues who'd worried about her, friends who'd invited her to dinners she'd politely declined, neighbors who'd brought casseroles and asked gentle questions about how she was holding up. Everyone had meant well, but their kindness had felt like pressure to be someone she no longer was. Margaret Holloway, the grieving grandmother, was a stranger to Margaret Holloway, the woman who'd raised her daughter and grandson with fierce independence, who'd worked her way through nursing school as a single mother, who'd been the person others turned to in emergencies. That woman had been competent, necessary, vital. This woman felt like a ghost haunting her own life. The cabin had seemed like an answer, a place where she could stop pretending to heal and simply exist until existence became too much effort. She'd imagined quiet days reading the books she'd never had time for, peaceful evenings watching the sunset paint the peaks in shades of rose and gold. She'd pictured herself finally learning to be alone without being lonely. But loneliness, she'd discovered, wasn't something you could outrun by moving to the mountains. It followed you like smoke, seeping into every corner of your new life, until even the most beautiful sunset felt empty without someone to share it with. Margaret poured her coffee and moved to the window, cradling the warm mug in both hands. The view was breathtaking, an untouched wilderness that stretched for miles in every direction, broken only by the thin ribbon of the access road that was probably impassable now until spring. She'd chosen isolation deliberately, but seeing that buried road made her chest tighten with something that felt dangerously close to panic. What if something happened to her? What if she fell or had a heart attack or simply ran out of medication before the snow melted? Who would know? Who would care enough to come looking? The coffee turned bitter in her mouth as she realized the truth she'd been avoiding. She'd come here not to live in solitude, but to die in it. The cabin wasn't a retreat. It was an elaborate, drawn-out suicide that would let her avoid the messy business of actually making that final choice. But now there was the boy, the mysterious child who'd appeared from nowhere and vanished just as quickly, leaving behind perfectly cut firewood and 1,000 questions. For the first time in months, Margaret found herself genuinely curious about something beyond her own grief. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and studied the tree line where he'd disappeared. Today, she decided, she would wait by the window. If he came back, when he came back, she would be ready. Margaret spent the entire morning stationed at the window, her coffee growing cold as she watched the forest. The snow had stopped, leaving behind a crystalline world so bright it hurt her eyes. Every shadow between the trees could hide a small figure. Every movement of wind-blown branches might mask the approach of silent footsteps. By noon, her back ached from the vigil, and doubt crept in like winter cold. Perhaps she really had imagined it all. The boy, the impossible strength, the perfect firewood. Perhaps isolation was finally claiming her sanity the way it had claimed so many others who'd tried to escape civilization's reach. She was heating soup for lunch when the soft thud came from outside. Margaret froze, ladle halfway to her mouth. The sound was unmistakable, something heavy being set down with deliberate care. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she crept to the window and peered around the curtain's edge. The boy stood at the edge of her small clearing, no more than 20 feet away. In daylight, without the obscuring veil of snow, she could see him clearly for the first time. He was small and slight, probably no older than 10, wearing that same red flannel shirt that hung loose on his thin frame. His dark hair was tousled, as if he'd been running, and his boots, too big for his feet, left deep impressions in the snow. But it was his face that made Margaret's breath catch. Even at this distance, even partially turned away as he arranged another load of split logs, something about his profile struck her like a physical blow. The slope of his nose, the determined set of his jaw, the way he tilted his head when concentrating. It can't be. Margaret pressed both hands against the glass, her pulse roaring in her ears. The boy worked with methodical precision, stacking the wood with the same careful attention to detail that Danny had always shown. Her grandson had been like that, meticulous in everything he did, whether building elaborate Lego castles or helping her plant tomatoes in her backyard garden. When the boy finished his task, he straightened and turned toward the cabin. For one heart-stopping moment, Margaret thought he might approach the door. Instead, he raised one small hand in what might have been a wave or simply an acknowledgement that he knew she was watching. That gesture shattered something inside her chest. Without thinking, Margaret yanked open the door and stumbled onto the covered porch, her bare feet hitting the icy boards. "Wait," she called out, her voice cracking from disuse and desperation. "Please, don't go." The boy paused at the tree line but didn't turn around. Margaret could see his shoulders tense beneath the faded flannel, as if her words had reached him, but he was fighting against responding. "I just want to talk," she said, stepping closer to the porch railing. The cold bit through her thin sweater, but she ignored it. "You don't have to be afraid. I'm not going to hurt you." For a moment that stretched like eternity, the boy remained motionless. Then, without looking back, he melted into the shadows between the pines as if he'd never existed at all. Margaret stood shivering on the porch long after he'd vanished, staring at the place where he'd disappeared. The fresh stack of firewood proved he'd been real, but everything else felt like grasping smoke. The familiar profile, the careful way he'd worked, that heartbreaking gesture of acknowledgement. Her mind was playing cruel tricks, overlaying Danny's memory onto a strange child who happened to share some superficial similarities. Yet, as she gathered the new logs, Margaret noticed something that made her hands tremble. Each piece of wood bore identical axe marks, clean, angled cuts that spoke of practiced skill and a particular technique. She'd seen those exact marks thousands of times before, during 30 years of marriage to Harold Holloway, who'd heated their Denver home with wood he split himself every autumn. Harold had been dead for 15 years. His tools were locked away in a storage unit she hadn't opened since Danny's funeral. No one else cut wood with that precise pattern of strikes. It had been his signature, as distinctive as handwriting. Margaret sank onto the porch steps, clutching a log against her chest. 3 impossible things now demanded explanation. A child who appeared from nowhere, wood that bore her dead husband's tool marks, and her own growing certainty that the boy's profile belonged to someone she'd buried 5 years ago. The rational part of her mind, the trained nurse who'd built a career on evidence and logic, screamed that grief was finally claiming her completely. But another part, the part that had held vigil beside too many deathbeds and witnessed too many unexplained moments in hospital corridors, whispered a different possibility. Margaret looked toward the forest where the boy had vanished, then at the wood in her arms, then at her own shaking hands. She faced a choice that would define whatever remained of her life: retreat into the safety of rational denial, or follow this impossible mystery wherever it led, even if it meant losing her grip on reality entirely. The mountain wind rose around her, carrying the scent of pine and snow and something else, something that smelled like the strawberry shampoo Danny had always used. Margaret closed her eyes and made her choice. Margaret opened her eyes and immediately regretted her decision. The rational voice in her head, the one that had guided her through 4 decades of medical crises, erupted in protest. "You're losing your mind," it whispered, with clinical precision. Grief-induced psychosis, early-onset dementia, isolation syndrome. The diagnostic terms tumbled through her consciousness like a medical textbook come to life, each one a lifeline back to sanity. She stood abruptly, still clutching the log to her chest, and stumbled back into the cabin. The warmth hit her like a slap, reminding her that she'd been sitting in sub-zero temperatures wearing nothing but a thin cardigan. Her feet were numb, her fingers aching from the cold. These were real sensations, proof that she still inhabited the physical world, that she hadn't completely surrendered to delusion. But the wood in her arms was real too. And those axe marks. Margaret set the log on her kitchen table and examined it under the battery-powered lantern. Harold's technique had been unmistakable. 3 precise strikes to split most pieces, always at the perfect angle to follow the grain. She'd watched him work countless Saturday mornings, bringing him coffee while he prepared their winter fuel supply. He'd been methodical, almost meditative in his approach, treating each log like a puzzle to be solved, rather than an obstacle to be conquered. These cuts were identical. Not similar. Identical. Her hands shook as she traced the smooth surfaces with her fingertips. Harold had been dead for 15 years. His tools were in storage. She'd seen them packed away herself, wrapped in old blankets and tucked into boxes she'd never had the courage to open again. Even if someone had somehow accessed them, who would know his exact technique, who would care enough to replicate it so perfectly? The strawberry scent lingered in the cabin's stale air, so faint she might have imagined it, but she knew she hadn't. Danny had used the same children's shampoo until he was 12, refusing to switch to grown-up products despite his mother's gentle teasing. Margaret had bought cases of it, stockpiling bottles in her bathroom cabinet so they'd never run out. After the accident, she'd found 3 unopened bottles and spent an entire afternoon holding them, breathing in that sweet artificial fragrance and sobbing until she thought her chest might crack open. She'd thrown them away eventually, or thought she had. Maybe her mind was simply dredging up sensory memories, overlaying them on mountain wind and pine smoke. Maybe. A sound outside made her freeze. Not the soft thud of delivered wood this time, but something else. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. Margaret crept to the window and peered through the gap in the curtains. Nothing moved in the clearing. The fresh snow lay unmarked except for her own footprints and the small boot prints the boy had left behind. But she could hear them clearly now, the soft crunch of someone walking carefully around her home's perimeter. He's coming back. The thought sent equal measures of terror and desperate hope coursing through her veins. He's coming to the door. But what if it wasn't the boy? What if her isolation had attracted other attention, the kind that meant real danger instead of impossible mystery? She was 67 years old, alone on a mountain, miles from help. If someone meant her harm, Margaret backed away from the window, her pulse hammering. She had Harold's old shotgun somewhere, packed away with their camping gear, but she couldn't remember the last time she'd fired it. And what if she was wrong? What if it really was the child, and she met his kindness with violence born of paranoia? The footsteps stopped directly outside her front door. Margaret held her breath, pressed against the far wall, every muscle in her body coiled tight. Seconds stretched into minutes. No knock came. No voice called out. Just silence so complete it felt like being buried alive. When she finally worked up the courage to check the window again, whoever it was had gone. But there, beside her front door, sat another stack of perfectly split firewood. Margaret sank into Harold's old rocking chair, her mind reeling. The pattern was becoming clear. Mysterious appearances, delivered wood, vanished benefactor. But the escalation troubled her. First, he'd stayed at the forest's edge. Then he'd come closer to the cabin. Now he'd actually approached her door, circled her home like a guardian or a predator. Or like a child working up courage to face someone he'd lost. The thought hit her like a physical blow. What if Danny? What if the impossible were somehow true? What if love really could transcend death, reaching across the void to help those left behind? But even as hope bloomed in her chest, terror followed close behind. If she allowed herself to believe, if she opened her heart to this impossible possibility, what would happen when reality inevitably reasserted itself? How many times could a heart break before it simply stopped beating altogether? Margaret rocked slowly in her chair, caught between desperate longing and protective fear, while outside her window, the mountain held its secrets close. Margaret sat in Harold's rocking chair until the sky began to darken, her mind churning like storm clouds. The silence pressed against her eardrums, broken only by the creak of old wood and her own ragged breathing. Every rational argument she'd constructed crumbled against the evidence stacked beside her door, wood split with Harold's technique, delivered by a child who moved like a ghost through forests that should have been impassable. The smart thing would be to barricade herself inside, lock the door, close the curtains, and wait for spring to melt the snow enough for her to escape back to civilization. She could return to Denver, find a small apartment near the hospital, maybe even take on some part-time work, surround herself with people and noise and the comfortable mundane reality that didn't include impossible children carrying timber from beyond the grave. But as darkness crept across the clearing, Margaret realized she couldn't retreat. Not anymore. For 5 years, she'd been running from the truth of Danny's death. from the gaping wound his absence had torn in her world. She tried staying busy, tried staying numb, tried staying away. Nothing had worked. The grief followed her like a shadow, patient and persistent, waiting for quiet moments to remind her that everyone she'd ever loved was gone. Now something was asking her to face that shadow head-on, to step into the unknown and confront possibilities that defied everything she thought she knew about life and death and the boundaries between them. Margaret rose from the chair, her joints protesting after hours of stillness. Her reflection in the dark window showed a woman on the edge of a precipice, wild-haired, hollow-eyed, wearing grief like a shroud. But beneath the exhaustion, she glimpsed something that had been missing for years: purpose. She moved through the cabin with sudden determination, gathering supplies, a heavy jacket, Harold's old work gloves, a battery-powered lantern, the emergency flares from her survival kit. If she was going to lose her mind, she'd do it properly armed. The decision crystallized. As she laced up her snow boots, she was done waiting, done watching from windows like a prisoner in her own refuge. When the boy returned, and he would return, she felt certain, she would be ready to follow him into whatever truth lay hidden in these mountains. Margaret paused at the door, her hand on the knob. Once she stepped outside, once she committed to pursuing this impossible mystery, there would be no pretending it hadn't happened, no retreating into comfortable denial. She would cross a threshold that divided the woman she'd been from whoever she might become. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like the first honest breath she'd taken in 5 years. She opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The cold hit her like a living thing, sharp enough to make her gasp. But she didn't retreat. Instead, she settled into the wooden chair she'd dragged outside, lantern at her feet, and fixed her gaze on the tree line. "I'm waiting," she called into the darkness, her voice carrying farther than seemed possible in the thin mountain air. "I know you can hear me. I'm not going inside until you show yourself." The forest absorbed her words without echo. Nothing moved among the shadows, but Margaret felt watched, studied with the intense focus of wild creatures deciding whether she posed threat or opportunity. Hours passed. The cold seeped through her layers until her bones ached, but Margaret remained motionless. This was bigger than her comfort, bigger than her fear. If there was even the smallest chance that love could reach across death to touch the living, she had to know. Somewhere in the darkness, a branch snapped under careful weight. Margaret's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain still. Another footstep, closer now, then another. Someone was approaching from the west, moving with deliberate stealth through underbrush that should have been impossible to navigate in pitch darkness. A small figure emerged from the tree line, just visible in the lantern's golden circle. The boy stood at the clearing's edge, that familiar red flannel shirt hanging loose on his thin frame. But tonight he carried no wood. Instead, he simply stood there, watching her with an intensity that made Margaret's chest tight. "Hello," she said softly, afraid any sudden movement might send him fleeing back into the forest. "Thank you for the firewood. You've been very kind." The boy tilted his head. Danny's gesture exactly, the way he'd always studied problems before attempting solutions. Then, moving with heartbreaking caution, he took a single step forward. Margaret's breath caught. This was the moment of choice, the threshold she couldn't uncross. She could retreat now, return to the safety of denial and rational explanation. Or she could stand and follow this impossible child into whatever lay beyond the boundaries of everything she'd believed possible. Margaret rose from her chair, lantern in hand, and took her first step into the unknown. The boy watched her approach with eyes that held depths no 10-year-old should possess. Margaret moved slowly, each footstep deliberate, the lantern's glow creating a bubble of amber light around them both. When she'd covered half the distance between porch and forest, he raised one small hand, not in greeting but in warning. She stopped immediately, understanding flooding through her like ice water. There were rules to this impossible encounter, boundaries she couldn't cross without invitation. The realization should have felt ridiculous, taking instructions from a child who might not even exist. Instead, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I don't know how this works." The boy's expression softened, and for a heartbreaking moment, Margaret saw pure compassion in his face. He gestured toward a fallen log halfway between them, then pointed to himself and back toward the trees. His meaning was clear. She could come that far, but no farther. Not yet. Margaret approached the designated spot and settled onto the makeshift seat, placing the lantern at her feet. The boy remained standing, but his posture relaxed slightly. They studied each other across the small gap of snow-covered ground that might as well have been an ocean. Up close, the resemblance was undeniable. The same dark hair that had never wanted to lie flat, the same serious brown eyes, the same way of holding his left shoulder slightly higher when he was thinking. But there were differences, too. This child was thinner than Danny had ever been, and there was something translucent about his skin, as if he were made of moonlight and memory rather than flesh and bone. "You look like someone I knew," Margaret said carefully. "Someone I loved very much." The boy nodded gravely, then pressed his hand to his chest and pointed toward her. His meaning struck her like lightning. "You look like someone I loved too." Tears blurred her vision. "Are you?" She couldn't finish the question. Saying the name aloud would either shatter this fragile moment or confirm something that would reshape everything she thought she knew about death. The boy stepped closer, close enough that the lantern light revealed details that made Margaret's heart stutter. A small scar on his chin from the bicycle accident when he was 7. A constellation of freckles across his nose that appeared every summer, despite liberal applications of sunscreen. The way his right eyebrow had a small cowlick that made it stick up at an angle. But it was the shirt that undid her completely. Not just red flannel. The red flannel, the one his mother had bought him for Christmas 2 years before the accident. Margaret had helped pick it out, had watched him wear it every weekend until it became too small, had folded it carefully into the donation bag after. "Danny?" The name escaped as barely a breath, but the boy's reaction was immediate and devastating. His face crumpled with an anguish so profound that Margaret instinctively reached toward him. Her hand passed through empty air. Where the boy had stood, only swirling snow remained, disturbed by the sudden absence of his form. No footprints marked his departure, no sound echoed through the forest. He had simply dissolved like mist touched by sunlight. Margaret sat frozen on the log, her hand still extended toward nothing. The rational part of her mind scrambled for explanations, hallucination, breakdown, grief-induced psychosis. But her heart knew better. She had looked into her grandson's eyes and seen recognition, love, and something else that chilled her to the bone: desperate need. A new sound broke the silence. Not footsteps this time, but something that made the hair on her arms stand up. A low, threatening growl from the darkness beyond the tree line. Multiple voices, she realized with growing terror. A pack of something large and hungry, drawn by the scent of a lone human in vulnerable territory. The lantern's battery was failing, its warm glow fading to a sickly yellow. Margaret stood quickly, backing toward the cabin, but the growls grew louder, closer, eyes reflected in the dying light. Too many pairs, arranged in a semicircle that cut off her retreat. Then Danny was there again, materializing between Margaret and the predators with a protective fury that transformed his gentle features into something fierce and ancient. He spread his arms wide, making himself a barrier, and unleashed a sound that no human throat could produce, a keening wail that seemed to come from the mountain itself. The eyes vanished, the growls faded to nothing. The forest fell silent except for the whisper of wind through pine needles. Danny turned to face Margaret, and she saw exhaustion in every line of his small body. Whatever he'd just done had cost him dearly. He gestured urgently toward the cabin, his message clear: go inside. Now, while you can. But Margaret had seen enough to understand the true scope of what was happening. This wasn't just about impossible reunions or comforting visitations. Danny wasn't just visiting, he was protecting her, standing guard between her and dangers she hadn't even recognized. The question that had been building all evening finally crystallized. What did he need from her in return? Margaret stumbled backward toward the cabin, her legs unsteady, but her eyes never left Danny's translucent figure. He remained positioned between her and the darkness, his small form radiating a protective intensity that seemed to bend the very air around him. The silence stretched taut as a wire, broken only by her ragged breathing and the distant whisper of wind through pine boughs. "I'm going," she whispered, not wanting to argue with whatever force had just saved her life. "But I'm not running away. Not anymore." Danny's shoulders sagged with relief, but he didn't move until she'd reached the porch steps. Only then did he begin to fade, his outline growing fainter with each passing second. Margaret gripped the railing, fighting the urge to call out, to beg him not to disappear again. She understood now that these encounters happened on his terms, governed by rules she was only beginning to glimpse. Inside the cabin, Margaret double-checked the locks and drew the curtains tight, though she suspected physical barriers meant little against whatever stalked these mountains. Her hands shook as she built up the fire, feeding its split logs that bore Harold's unmistakable axe marks. The flames caught quickly, casting dancing shadows that made her jump at every flicker. She needed a plan. Whatever was happening here, supernatural visitation, elaborate hallucination, or something else entirely, it was escalating. Danny's appearances were becoming more frequent, more intense, and if he was truly protecting her from real dangers, then she needed to understand what those threats were and why they'd focused on her isolated cabin. Margaret pulled out the journal she'd been keeping since arriving at the mountain, its pages mostly filled with mundane observations about weather and wildlife. Now she turned to a fresh sheet and began documenting everything she could remember. The timeline of Danny's appearances, the specific details that proved his identity, the protective behavior she'd witnessed tonight. As she wrote, patterns began to emerge that chilled her more than the October cold. Danny had first appeared during the snowstorm that threatened to trap her without adequate firewood. He'd provided exactly what she needed to survive, nothing more. His protection tonight had been fierce but measured, driving off the predators without pursuing them, disappearing immediately after the threat passed. It felt like a debt being repaid. But what debt could a 10-year-old child possibly owe his grandmother? The answer, when it came, nearly broke her heart. She remembered the last conversation they'd had, the night before the accident. Danny had been upset about something at school. A bully who'd been tormenting smaller children, teachers who didn't listen, a system that seemed rigged against anyone who couldn't fight back. He'd asked her, with the serious intensity only children possessed, whether grown-ups ever really kept their promises to protect kids. "Always," she'd told him, smoothing his dark hair back from his forehead. "The people who love you will always find a way to keep you safe, no matter what." 2 days later, he'd been gone, killed in an accident that no amount of love or vigilance could have prevented. Her promise had become a lie, and he'd carried that knowledge into whatever came after death. Now he was keeping the promise she'd broken, protecting her the way she hadn't been able to protect him. Margaret closed the journal and stared into the fire, tears streaming down her cheeks. The supernatural logic was impossible to accept, but it explained everything: the guilt-driven manifestation, the protective behavior, the exhaustion she'd seen in his small face after driving off the pack. He was trying to balance scales that could never be balanced, to repair damage that went soul-deep. "Oh, Danny," she whispered to the empty cabin, "you don't owe me anything. I'm the one who failed you." But even as she spoke the words, Margaret knew they wouldn't be enough. Guilt was a powerful force, capable of binding souls to impossible tasks. If Danny truly was reaching across death to protect her, then simple absolution wouldn't free him. She needed to understand the full scope of whatever supernatural contract held him here. Margaret moved to the window and peered through the curtains. The clearing lay empty under starlight, but she could feel watchful presence in the surrounding darkness. Not threatening now, but vigilant. Danny was still out there, standing guard against dangers she couldn't see or understand. Tomorrow, she would venture beyond the safety of her cabin's immediate surroundings. She would follow the trail of mysteriously delivered firewood to its source, even if it meant hiking deep into wilderness that might be more than naturally treacherous. Because if her grandson was trapped between worlds by misplaced guilt and protective love, then she owed it to him to find whatever truth lay hidden in these mountains. The question wasn't whether she was strong enough to face what she might discover. The question was whether she could live with herself if she didn't try. Dawn came pale and thin through the frost-covered windows, but Margaret had been awake for hours, her supplies spread across the kitchen table like surgical instruments. The emergency flares, protein bars, extra batteries, Harold's compass. Everything she might need for a journey that could destroy her sanity or her life. Possibly both. She'd traced the path of delivered firewood in her mind a dozen times, trying to map the impossible. The logs appeared beside her cabin door, but they had to come from somewhere. Trees didn't cut themselves into perfect lengths, and phantom children, even ones with her grandson's face, needed a source for their mysterious gifts. Margaret laced her hiking boots with fingers that trembled only slightly. 5 years of grief had taught her to function through fear, to push forward when every instinct screamed retreat. But this was different. This wasn't about managing loss anymore. It was about confronting truths that could shatter everything she thought she knew about death. The first 100 yards beyond her clearing felt familiar, following the worn path she'd walked dozens of times for water and wildlife observation. But where that trail curved toward the stream, Margaret continued straight, following faint depressions in the forest floor that might have been footprints, or might have been her desperate imagination. The wilderness swallowed her quickly. Pine branches closed overhead, filtering sunlight into cathedral dimness that made distance impossible to judge. She marked her progress with small cairns of stacked stones, breadcrumbs for a journey that might leave her too broken to find her way back. An hour in, she discovered the first impossibility. A massive pine had fallen across a narrow ravine, creating a natural bridge 30 feet above rushing water. The tree was easily 3 feet in diameter, ancient and solid, but its trunk bore fresh axe marks, not random damage from its fall, but deliberate cuts, precise notches that would have taken hours of skilled work to complete. Margaret ran her gloved fingers over the marks, her breath coming in sharp puffs. She knew those cuts, had watched Harold make identical ones thousands of times. The specific angle of the blade, the rhythmic spacing, the way each notch bit slightly deeper on the left side because of his old shoulder injury. These weren't similar marks made by someone else's axe. These were Harold's cuts, unmistakable as his fingerprints. Harold, who'd been dead for 3 years. Harold, whose axe was locked in her cabin's storage shed. The bridge led to terrain she'd never seen before, though she'd lived on this mountain for 8 months. The trees grew different here, older, more twisted, with bark that seemed to shift and writhe in her peripheral vision. The very air felt thicker, charged with electricity that made her fillings ache. Margaret crossed anyway. Each step on the fallen trunk took her further from rational explanation, deeper into a realm where love and loss operated by different laws. Halfway across, she looked down at the rushing water and saw faces in the foam, familiar features that dissolved the moment she tried to focus on them, but lingered long enough to stop her heart. Danny, Harold, her parents, her sister, everyone she'd ever lost, gathered in the churning current like some twisted reunion. "I'm coming," she whispered, though whether to the living or the dead she couldn't say. The far side of the ravine opened onto a clearing that defied geography. It was too large for the mountain's slope, too perfectly circular to be natural. At its center stood a cabin that made Margaret's chest seize with recognition and terror. Her childhood home, the mountain retreat, where she'd spent summers with her grandparents, where she'd learned to identify bird calls and treat minor injuries with whatever nature provided. The place that had burned down 40 years ago, taking her grandfather with it. But here it stood, smoke rising from its chimney, windows glowing with warm lamplight, neat stacks of firewood, cut to the exact lengths she'd been finding at her door, lined the covered porch. Margaret approached on legs that felt disconnected from her body. This was her greatest fear made manifest, that grief had finally snapped her mind completely, that she'd crossed from harmless delusion into dangerous madness. But it was also her deepest hope realized. That death wasn't the ending she'd believed it to be. The cabin door opened before she could knock. Danny stood in the doorway, solid and real as living flesh, but his eyes held depths that spoke of journeys no child should have taken. Behind him, Margaret glimpsed movement in the shadows, other figures watching with the patient attention of those who had waited very long for this moment. "Grandma Maggie," Danny said, and his voice carried the weight of words saved across years of silence. "We've been waiting for you to be ready." Margaret stepped across the threshold, leaving behind the world of physical laws and rational explanation. Whatever lay ahead, revelation or madness, reunion or reckoning, she would face it beside the grandson whose love had reached across death itself to bring her home. The door closed behind her with the finality of a coffin lid, or the whisper of wings taking flight. The warmth inside the cabin felt wrong against Margaret's skin, too intense, too immediate, like stepping into a fever dream. Danny moved away from the door with fluid grace, but his footsteps made no sound on the familiar wooden planks. The silence stretched between them, heavy with 5 years of unspoken grief. "This isn't real," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible in the hushed space. "You're dead. I buried you. I watched them lower your coffin into the ground." Danny's expression didn't change, but something flickered across his features, pain so profound it seemed to bend the lamplight around him. "Real isn't what you think it is anymore, Grandma Maggie." The other figures emerged from the shadows with deliberate slowness, and Margaret's world tilted sideways. Harold stepped forward first, his flannel shirt clean and pressed, his work boots free of the mountain mud that had caked them in life. Behind him came Margaret's grandfather, still wearing the clothes he'd died in 40 years ago, the smell of smoke clinging to his form like a shroud. "No." Margaret backed toward the door, her hands fumbling for the handle. "This is impossible. You're all gone. I grieved for you. I let you go." The door wouldn't budge. Her fingers slipped against wood that felt solid one moment, insubstantial the next. Panic rose in her throat like bile. "We never left," Harold said, his voice carrying the same gentle authority it had in life. "We've been here all along, waiting for you to see." "Waiting for what?" Margaret's words came out as a sob. "I don't understand any of this. I just wanted to live out my last years in peace. I just wanted to remember you without losing my mind." Danny moved closer, and Margaret saw the terrible truth written in his young face, the exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness, the weight of responsibilities no child should carry, the desperate, driving need that had pulled him back from whatever rest the dead were meant to find. "You're trapped," she breathed, understanding flooding through her like ice water. "All of you. You can't move on." "Not trapped," her grandfather corrected, his voice crackling like old paper. "Bound. By love that won't let go. By guilt that won't heal. By promises that can't be kept." Margaret sank into the nearest chair, the same rocking chair where she'd sat as a child, listening to bedtime stories that always ended with everyone safe and loved. The wood felt solid beneath her, but when she looked down, she could see through her own hands to the cushion below. "Oh God," she whispered. "I'm dead too, aren't I? The cold, the exhaustion, the hallucinations. I'm dying out there in the snow." Danny knelt beside the chair, his translucent fingers reaching toward her, but stopping just short of contact. "Not dying, Grandma Maggie. Not yet. But close enough to cross over for a little while, close enough to hear us." The cabin around them began to shift and blur at the edges, reality bleeding away like watercolors in rain. Margaret realized with crystalline clarity that she was losing precious time, that whatever window had opened between worlds was already beginning to close. "What do you need from me?" she asked urgently. "What's keeping you here?" Harold and her grandfather exchanged a look that spoke of long conferences in the space between heartbeats. But it was Danny who answered, his child's voice carrying weight that made the air itself seem to bend. "We need you to let us protect you. We need you to let us love you the way we couldn't in life. But what? But every time we save you, Every time we keep you safe, it pulls us further from the light." Danny's form flickered like a candle flame in wind. "We're fading, Grandma Maggie. All of us. And soon we won't be strong enough to help anyone." The crushing weight of understanding settled over Margaret's shoulders. Her family, her beloved dead, were sacrificing their eternal rest to keep her alive. Their love had become a chain that bound them to a world they should have left behind, and that chain was destroying them. "Then I'll die," she said simply. "I'll stop fighting. I'll let the mountain take me, and you can all rest." "No." The word tore from Danny with such force that the cabin walls shuddered. "That's not— we can't—" But his protest faded into silence as his form began dissolving at the edges. The other figures were fading too, becoming translucent, their features blurring into suggestions of memory. Margaret reached toward her grandson with hands that passed through empty air. The cabin was dissolving around her, walls becoming wind, warmth becoming bitter cold. She was falling backward through time and space, through love and loss, back toward a world where the dead stayed buried and the living died alone. The last thing she heard was Danny's voice, distant as starlight. "We can't let you go." Then darkness claimed her, and Margaret understood that some forms of love were too strong to survive.